Hey everybody, Relay here. Welcome back to another segment of Flop or Not, where I determine if a game flops or if it doesn't. Today we'll be looking at Fire Emblem 3 Houses on the Switch. For those of you who aren't familiar with the title, Fire Emblem 3 Houses is a tactical RPG, which pretty well just means turn-based RPG, where the characters you control are limited to moving along certain tiles, which usually involves a more strategic approach. I know it's a Switch game which is a little different, but I'm trying to diversify a little bit. So we'll see how that goes, and if you want, or if you're interested, then I might do a few more Switch games on top of that. So starting with the environment. The majority of the game takes place in the monastery, or Garreg Mach, which is basically like a castle environment, which has a few locations like a dining hall, a pond that you can fish in, the tournament area, the students' rooms, the dorms, I guess you can call them, a greenhouse, and a church. And that's pretty much it, excluding the odd areas here and there, like where the professor's rooms are and where the queen, or I guess the head of the church, kind of hangs out. One thing that you'll note, even playing the game, is that the weather, even the seasons, don't really change the conditions in the monastery. It always looks the same. It's always bright and sunny. It was never like a slight overcast or a rain in that area. It's always the same look, so it's a little bland in that regard. But other than that, you spend the majority of your time bonding and teaching the students. You do certain activities which increases their motivation, which is like a mechanic in the game where the student can learn more if they're more motivated. And otherwise, you can go fishing, which provides you with meals that you can use to boost motivation, or when you cook meals, you can actually give you and your class a attribute for the rest of the month for battles, like a certain boost in strength or dexterity. You can also go to the greenhouse, which has a similar effect. You can use certain things that you cultivate in the greenhouse as a cooking recipe, and sometimes you can use whatever you acquire in the greenhouse as a gift to someone else to kind of boost their motivation. Additionally, every month they hold a tournament based on a certain weapon type. It varies throughout the game, but this enables you to make a little bit of extra cash, and oftentimes includes a weapon reward as well. The only other part that's a bit of a downfall is that I guess this only comes once a week. So you get your day off, which is, I believe, Sunday or Monday. No, I believe it's Sunday. And you spend this Sunday either battling, exploring the monastery, so talking to people, doing all those activities, or just skipping or resting the day. The rest kind of boosts everybody's motivation, but it doesn't really allow you to do anything else. It just continues on with the other week. And so that's an interesting mechanic. They kind of give you one day to do a free-for-all, and then after that, you continue with pretty much the main story of the game. In battles, the environment is a bit different. So in story missions and paralog missions, which are like side quests that relate to the story, the terrain varies from mission to mission, which is nice. At least they give you a variety. And sometimes they have certain tiles which give you different buffs and debuffs, and only certain units can go on to. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the battle mechanics section. But other than that, the other quests, when there's no side or story quest to complete, just a random quest, those are bland and they're incredibly repetitive. The terrain that they put you on is often the same terrain over and over again for a month or 2 months at a time. So those are somewhat bland. Moving on to the graphics. Now, please note, as I've mentioned in my other videos, I think it's important to say that graphics are nothing to what makes a good game. However, having nice visuals occasionally is kind of a bonus. So the graphics in, let's just start with the facts here. We're dealing with the Switch, which is incredibly hardware limited. Even if you optimize your game as best you can, that thing doesn't really run games any better than my phone would, if I'm being honest. In handheld mode, the graphics look okay. They're pretty crisp, but as soon as you dock it, you notice like a decrease in sharpness as well as detail. It kind of looks a little bit unrefined. I don't know, I don't like it quite as much as in handheld, so I tend to keep it in that for the simplicity of the fact that you can carry it around and it looks still just fine on a smaller screen, but as soon as you scale it up, it loses quite a bit of sharpness, that's for sure. As far as the graphics go as well, outside of just playing in docked mode, I found that the attacks of certain weapons and like certain skills are kind of lackluster. They didn't have too much detail in them. Aside from the magic always looks pretty cool because they put a lot of artwork into it, but just using like a sword skill or an axe skill or a brawler skill, you'll find that the attacks are bland. Like there's no real artwork behind them, which is kind of sad to see a little bit. Heading over to the story aspect now. This is probably one of the most story-rich games you can actually get on the Switch. I'm genuinely impressed at the depth and the amount of detail they put into this particular Fire Emblem game. Like if you go to the library, for example, just a side note, you can actually read about all the families and their ties to the students, as well as their background. You can kind of get to know them a bit. For if you got time for that. Otherwise, just continue with the story. But I just found it kind of a cool little detail on the side. But if I had to make a resume, you're essentially a mysterious mercenary turned teacher once recruited by the Church of Seiros, where you end up building a bond with your students and fellow teachers. And you do this week by week, and you're really able to see a bit of character development in each different character, which is kind of cool. Towards the end of the game, you kind of reflect back on it. Eventually, a series of events causes a shift at the monastery, and it's left abandoned. Or at least it was thought to be abandoned. 5 years later, the students remember a promise they made to the professor saying they would show back up at the monastery or at Garreg Mach, which they hold true to their promise, and you meet up with these students 5 years later, and they've all done their own character growth, character development, and this pretty much sets up the second half, the more serious half of the game. On to the battle mechanics now. You play around the weaknesses and strengths of your enemies. So certain troops have vulnerabilities. For example, heavy armor is weak to magic, and flying troops are weak to bow. So you kind of play around those, and that way, if you play weaknesses and you're smart, you can make do with minimal casualties to your team or your class. Now, there are certain tiles as well which offer you certain benefits, which kind of include like health buffs, and there are certain tiles where you can fly on, as mentioned earlier, which only flying units can stand on. There are also tiles which add a debuff to your character, so if you stand in certain tiles, sometimes they have like a poison effect where you'll be poisoned and you'll take damage every turn as long as you stay on there, as well as a fire. Same concept as just damage as long as you're on that tile. And lastly, there is a tile which it's called an arms tile, or at least I call it that, and it's basically a special tile where there's like a mounted weapon that certain classes can use, usually archers, bows. They can use these tiles and they can shoot from a much further distance away and avoid any kind of damage. This being said, the difficulty of the game isn't really overwhelming. It's more of easy to moderate. And even though I played on the hardest difficulty and in the classic mode, which is a mode that older Fire Emblems have used in the past, which if one of your teammates or one of your students die, then they stay dead for the remainder of the game. The funny thing is, the prime mechanic in this game involves a time exploit, so you're able to go back in time multiple times during any battle and fix any mistakes up to a certain amount. I can't remember exactly how much, but you can fix any mistakes you made. So I find the whole classic theme playing in classic mode almost redundant, because you can immediately undo whatever wrong step you made the last turn or the turn before to correct it. So it's like they almost cancel themselves out. It's almost a useless mechanic, especially when you're trying to play in classic mode. It's interesting that they'd still add that in classic mode when classic mode is supposed to be more, you're supposed to be playing more defensive, more reserved to avoid losses. Anywho, that's just a interesting add-on. Aside from that, the game isn't super difficult as long as you play with the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of the enemies. And last but not least, as far as crafting and equipment goes, the game isn't super heavy on it. Crafting is limited to weapon upgrades, which occasionally have like these side branches for different upgrade paths, but it's pretty much just mediocre. There's nothing too special. It's worth noting that weapons also have a durability rating, and if they degrade for long enough, then they'll break, which, you know, leads you to having to use resources to repair them. So that part is you know, a bit tedious, but I mean, it is what it is. And as for the equipment, The equipment is limited to on-hand, off-hand, and like an accessory. So it's usually a shield or a ring. And of course, your on-hand is your primary weapon, which will be your axe, your sword, your bow, the fists, your lance, and that's pretty well all of them. The offhand is usually some sort of shield. They come with a weight penalty as well, so you can't move as much if you use the heavier shields. And the rings, what they do is they boost a certain attribute. So they'll boost your strength, your luck, your avoidance, all those things, even your crit. By the way, if you have to invest in a certain stat, I would strongly invest in the critical stat or the avoidance, because those will honestly net you probably the best results, especially in battle. When you hit crits, it's beautiful. So just keep that in mind. Aside from that, there's no armor in the game. You can't beef up your characters. You can't give them certain armors, which will further diversify their defense or their dexterity or their avoidance. But in terms of equipment, you're left with just your weapon and an accessory of your choice, whether it's a shield or a ring. So all in all, flop or not, Fire Emblem Three Houses does most certainly not flop. And it's one of the better Switch games I've played. If you're looking for a game to get the best bang for your buck out of, it's probably right up that alley as well. And if you're a fan of tactical RPG games, honestly, you can't go wrong. If you have anything to say, or if you have anything you want to add to the review, feel free to comment, and take her easy.